Well, good morning, George.
G'day, mate.
If you were in possibly parts of South America, do you know how they would pronounce your name?
Jorge?
Yeah, Jorge. Jorge. Good morning, Jorge. I would be Patrica, technically.
I have many friends just call me Jorge.
Oh, really?
Quite used to it.
It always freaked me out. Growing up in the Catholic Church, the word or the name Jesus was quite a sort of, you wouldn't consider calling your kids that, but within sort of the Latino or Spanish community, Jesus is really common. And I didn't put two and two together till I was quite a long way into adulthood that Jesus was the same word, just pronounced correctly, the H sound for the J.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's funny.
It's like Muhammad as well, right? It's an extremely popular name in the
Islamic world. Yeah. It's funny, isn't it? Because that's right, actually. I mean, I think Jesus is maybe more amongst the Catholic population, which is heavily in the Latino world, where Muhammad, but not maybe in other denominations within the Christian faith, but Muhammad is amongst all of Islam. So yeah, it's an interesting little side.
Well, that is interesting because like the Romans are into their icons, right? Whereas Muslims are, Muhammad was a iconoclast in that, depictions and idols were a no-go. But yet there's people named after him. That's interesting. Comparative religious studies 101.
Yeah, thank you for joining us today for Religion 101 on BHN, Big Hearing News. We're fucking awesome at religion. Chewy's going to be joining us at some stage as well. I think he's rebooting his computer. I just resent him the link, and so we'll be having him jump in and have a conversation. But today, albeit George, kind of you're on Chewy's show because I've been busy this morning and haven't been able to do any prep work with you guys at all. So thank you for getting up and getting involved in the show.
We've got Richard Jackson. Yeah, we've got Richard Jackson from the New Zealand Peace and Conflict Studies Centre, the National Peace and Conflict Studies Centre at Otago University down here in Dunedin.
Yep.
And we thought yesterday we had the president of the RSA talking about ANZAC Day, and so today we thought we'd get an academic, but also a self-described pacifist in to talk about that. So that will be coming up in a wee while. And as for the rest of the show, the war drums of the election continue. We're going to be looking at some commentary around the ongoing tax debate, and Christopher Luxon's. We'll look at some of Christopher Luxon's appearances in the media in the last 24 hours.
Yeah, I think this conversation goes on. I think we talked yesterday, maybe off here. I think Chewy's with us now. Chewy, you're with us now. Good morning, sir.
Hello.
I think off here we talked a bit about, and I don't want to be seen as someone just kind of smashing Chris Luxon all the time. But what I am keen to do is, call a spade when we can. And he doesn't seem to be very good at maybe the messaging or the skill of the interview when it comes to the media. I mean, the admission, I guess there's twofold, right? There's the admission of how he doesn't need the tax break, but any good journalist can also then go on to work out how much tax break someone on this much money would get. But I think the balls up was him saying, I don't need it. I think although people who are very wealthy, a lot of money coming in, you can always say, well, everyone could do with a bit more money, even if you don't need it. Everyone can do a bit more money. I mean, it's more money I could put towards, charitable causes. You could make up a story, a narrative, I guess, that would fill in with that. Yes, I'm getting a massive tax cut because I'm earning massive money, but just to say, I don't need it. I think that is I'm imagining that's going to be on the Labour Party advertising loop come next year leading up to the election, because, what it looks like is basically someone saying, we're making tax cut primarily for wealthy people who don't need it, like me. Whereas the people who do need it, go fuck yourselves. My paraphrase. Let's be fair to say that's my paraphrase. But I can imagine he's just written the advert for the Labour Party for next year, hasn't he? So anyway,
the classic deflection for that, John Key did it. I'm just going to donate all of my paycheck to charity. Whether he actually did that or not, I'm not sure. But
what he said was, I think he's going to donate his first paycheck, like his first year. It was never promised in the subsequent years. I remember that was a big talkback topic at the time, because a lot of John Key supporters.
That's a. I mean, just to finish off before Richard Jackson interview, that's a funny to say, I'd spend that extra money on charity is hilarious. It's like, well, if you tax that money, we as a country get together and decide where that money goes.
And funny, you could actually bring this back to, we started today, Chewy, you missed it, with Religion 101. You could bring it right back to the idea of tithing. The idea of tithing is that you bring your offerings to the storehouse, because the community can then, like, if everyone brings a little to the storehouse, then the people running the storehouse can then donate it out in bigger chunks. And I know that Mr. Luxon was talking about his very personal religious faith the other day. So some could argue that not being personally involved with it, but more giving it to a storehouse of sorts, is a more biblical way of looking at the world, Mr. Luxon, a world that you adhere to, perhaps, possibly, maybe. I don't know, just speculating. Over to you, George.
Yeah, all right. So this morning we are going to be talking to Professor Richard Jackson, of the National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies. Let's bring him in. Good morning, Richard.
Good morning.
Morning, Richard.
Hi.
morning.
We yesterday we had on. I think we'll start with some ANZAC Day stuff, and yesterday we had the RSA president on, which was an interesting conversation. BJ Clark is his name, and we did sort of discuss, I guess, and also I should say that Richard has an article in Newsroom, which he writes for on occasion. This ANZAC Day, let's honour the dead by ending war. And I guess this is sort of what we're centering our conversation around today. But I think we'll start off Richard, by looking at some of the conversation yesterday that we had with BJ. And Pat asked him a really interesting question about how the RSA and that sort of veteran community view conscientious objectors. We'll have a look at that.
Baxter. And I was just interested, as I was hearing you talk, and especially about it not being a place to glorify war. How does the RSA think of, and what do the members kind of think of, the pacifism message and those conscientious objectors who refused to fight? I'm not even asking necessarily for an official position, but how are the people who maybe are in our history who have been the conscientious objectors, how are they kind of thought of and treated by the RSA?
To be honest, I've never raised that discussion or had that discussion, and maybe that's something that to enhance my my knowledge I should have. And I think probably, if I look at some of the historical reading that I've seen, I think at the time, I think they were treated harshly. Because, it was expected that you went down the road and signed up. And I think anyone who didn't, was probably treated quite harshly.
Yeah, so, I mean, that was interesting that BJ hadn't really thought about it. I wonder from you, Richard, and for the viewers, Richard is also a member of the Archibald Baxter Memorial Trust, which got a memorial here in Dunedin, which I guess sort of does indicate some sort of I guess progression here in terms of how conscientious objectors have become part of the national memory when it comes to World War One and Anzac Day.
Well, look, I think there is progress certainly being made. When we think more broadly about remembering World War One and remembering war, what we've got to remember, or what we've got to think about, is the fact that the way in which we remember often also involves forgetting. So we elevate one narrative over a whole series of others. And I mean, in part, that's natural because war is so big and so complicated that, you know, it's hard to get all the stories in there. But I think one of the positive things that we've seen in the last few years, particularly since the 100-year anniversary, where a great deal of effort was put into sort of remembering New Zealand's involvement in war, is that the narratives have started to expand. So we've started to think about and acknowledge not just the conscientious objectors, but also the people who were shot for desertion, for example. And we've started to realize actually those people are also a part of the story, and they need to be remembered, not as traitors and shirkers and so on, but as people who suffered such immense trauma that they weren't able to fight. And then we compounded that trauma by executing them and shaming their families. And so some effort's gone to kind of make that right. And then, as you've noted, we put up this memorial last year to the conscientious objectors because they're an important part of the story. You know, thousands of people actually refused to go and fight. And then they suffered consequences in the years afterwards. They were denied jobs. They were often shunned. Even today, members of families are split down the middle, sometimes between those who have relatives who fought and they wear the medals, and then those who have relatives who were conscientious objectors and refused to recognize the validity of war. And those things continue today. And I think it's really important, if we're going to have war remembrance, that we try to bring in all the different narratives, even when they conflict with each other. I mean, one of the things that kind of annoys me is the way in which war remembrance is so depoliticized. You know, we take out all the politics of it. And we say, no, it was just a glorious sacrifice for our freedom and what have you. Yeah. And we forget about actually the deep political conflicts that occurred. And so even when those wars were happening, there were different sides of society that, you know, in New Zealand, there were some Māori groups that fought and others that really resisted and said, no, we're not going to fight for the empire because the empire has, you know, dispossessed us and is part of our oppressive history. Similarly, you know, we've got to think about different groups of people, women. We even thinking about animals, you know, millions of animals, particularly horses, were killed in World War I. And there, you know, there's a little bit of a movement there to try and remember their sacrifice as well. So, yeah, I think what we've got to do is try and have more nuanced and political and honest and historically accurate kind of conversations around how we remember war.
Hey, Richard, it's interesting hearing you say how important to remember the pacifists that were involved, the people, the non-combatants, the people who didn't want to fight. When I asked that, it was one of those questions in the conversation yesterday with the president of the RSA, in full respect to him for coming on having a chat with us, which kind of, I thought of, it wasn't a pre-prepared question. You know, it was off the cuff and I was thinking about it, but I was quite surprised to hear the response that he had never really thought about that before. You know, the president of the body who looks after the veterans had never really had a conversation around how do we look after the objecting veterans who are still, I guess, veterans. Two kind of questions about that. if, as you're saying, if it's an important part of our remembrance or our acknowledging, it seems that we're not acknowledging that side of it. I'm happy to open your comments about that. But the second thing is, based on that, you describe yourself as a radical pacifist. What does that actually mean? So yeah, there's a couple of things.
Okay, look, the first question is an excellent one. I mean, it doesn't surprise me in a way, because I think what we've seen over the last sort of 50 years is a concerted effort by sort of the leaders of our society, not just political leaders, but also cultural leaders, to wed the ANZAC military narrative to our national identity.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not something that just happened naturally or spontaneously. If you look at the history of it, it took a lot of effort to build war memorials, to get society to come together every year to remember books, movies, television shows, novels, practices in schools were all brought in. There was a major effort to try and make New Zealand's involvement in war the main defining narrative of our national identity. And what that does is it covers over and it suppresses the other stories. And so it's no surprise then that people haven't really thought about or considered or know much about the alternative stories, like the peace traditions, the nonviolent activists, the people who resisted war, including pacifists and conscientious objectors. So that doesn't surprise me. And in many ways, I think the issue here is that we're talking about kind of a larger struggle for the identity of New Zealand. And to my mind, we have at least two very strong cases to be made. On the one hand, New Zealand has a very long tradition, which is celebrated in ANZAC and so on, of being involved in the imperial complex and then going to war on behalf of the British Empire and the Anglosphere, fighting in Vietnam on behalf of the Western Bloc, and then involvement in peacekeeping because we feel we've got international obligations and so on. And so our war involvement is one very strong strand of our identity. But the other side of our identity is a very powerful peace tradition, which goes back to the Moriori and to Parihaka and to other different Māori groups. It also goes back to the Peace Pledge Union, and it goes back to the anti-nuclear campaigners, to those who've campaigned against war. And so, we could have decided as a nation that our primary identity was not based around war, but it was based around peace. And then perhaps we would have chosen different days and different ceremonies and different monuments and different kind of symbols to be the thing that we come together around to remember. But I think instead we've chosen this kind of war identity.
Do you think it's changed a bit since like the 80s, especially since maybe Greenpeace and Rainbow Warrior, that we are certainly more of a country with an identity around peace and non-conflict than perhaps we were prior to that? Some would say glorifying, others would say commemorating, Gallipoli and World War I and World War II. Oh, have we slid down the scale a bit, I guess is what I'm asking.
Look, I think things are much, much better. Yes, definitely. And I think there are more stories out there, and there's a bit more tolerance for that peace side. But at the same time, I don't think we can take that too far, because my own experience is that, the memorial we built to Archibald Baxter and the conscientious objectors, I mean, from the very beginning, it's had a bit of graffiti and a bit of resistance to it. There are always people in the newspaper and people who say, this is the White Feather Brigade, and they were cowards and shirkers, and why should we honour them? We on Anzac Day, we organise a peace service which specifically focuses on remembering all the victims of war and pledging ourselves to work to the end of war. If you look at the number of people who come to that versus the number of people who go to the cenotaph and the service there, I mean, it's still a minority. So while it's better, I think the dominant culture is still very much that we honor our war dead and that our national identity is tied in a very sacred way to the Anzac mythology.
I count Anzac Day as being a really important day for me, but I've had some quite interesting discussions. It's funny how much I mean, you mentioned people talk about the White Feather Brigade and stuff like that. We're 107 years on from the first Anzac Day, and people are still talking in that way. Even with everything that we've learned about how conscientious objectors were treated, how people were punished in the field and that sort of thing, and all of the discussion around the Baxter Memorial. I mean, people were discussing that when I was living in Wellington 6-7 years ago, that there was a push to get that on the waterfront up there, and very, very strong opinions even after that length of time. And I sort of brought this up with our guest yesterday, is that it's very easy for those national myths to grow. And I often compare Anzac services here and people's knowledge of Gallipoli and that sort of thing with our friends across the ditch. And they almost have a more patriotic, more jingoistic view of Anzac Day than perhaps we do here in New Zealand. I've always found that pretty interesting.
Yes, absolutely. I wrote a photo essay a while back about the War Memorial in Melbourne, which is really fascinating because it's called the Shrine of Remembrance. And in the central part of it, there's a Bible verse inscribed on the ground, which at 11 past 11 a.m. the sun shines on part of it. The love part, it's the Bible verse about greater love hath no man than he lay down his life for his friends. And the whole thing is just such a deeply religious and sacred kind of site. And the soldier that is immortalized in granite or whatever looks like Jesus Christ, has a Jesus Christ kind of pose. So I mean, to me, when you look at these sort of things, you realize how deeply spiritual and religious this is. If you look at the language that's used in the ceremonies, the kind of prayers that are said and the hymns that are sung, I mean, this is a deep religious and sacred kind of ideology here. We're talking here about people's deepest beliefs. And so the belief in sacred sacrifice for nation, I mean, it's not surprising. It then becomes, the focal point of your identity. And any threat to that then becomes something that you have to fight against very vigorously. So you not only have to fight against that in terms of denouncing people who would question it, but you have to put out doubts as well. So this is where the forgetting comes in. And a lot of war remembrance is deliberately designed around forgetting, for example, the massacres that have happened, the human rights abuses, the cases where New Zealand and Australian soldiers went out there and slaughtered innocent people. You have to forget about the kind of war crimes, the horror of war, the fact that more civilians than soldiers always die in war. The fact that wars often end by making things much worse than when you started, and that the reasons for going to war were often nothing to do with democracy or freedom or human rights, but actually to do with keeping markets, to keeping control and power, suppressing indigenous people. You've got to forget all of that. You've got to somehow push all that away and say, no, They died for sacred reasons. They died for our community. And so it's no wonder that it becomes kind of jingoistic. And I think it takes a great deal of effort to actually push through that and try to find a more nuanced and more truthful way of remembering war. I think it is possible, but I don't see a lot of effort in that.
Yeah, it's extremely frustrating how it almost seems to the sort of average Anzac Day goer that it was it wasn't people that made the decision to send troops overseas. Like it was almost like it just happened, right? And that we should support veterans when they come back, but for some reason we shouldn't support them not going in the first place, right? I wonder, Richard. I mean, you made a brilliant point also about it's sort of like a secular sacredness, right, of Anzac Day, and that's been sort of coupled together with, I think, the national identity of New Zealand as this peaceful place with the Rainbow Warrior and all these sorts of things. Those sort of get harnessed and deployed when it comes to maybe our foreign policy interests and our tagging along with so-called peacekeeping missions in Afghanistan and that sort of thing. I wonder what are the sort of lessons and successes of the peace movement, and you call yourself a pacifist. What are the sort of lessons and successes of the peace movement and pacifism in this in more contemporary times? So I'm thinking of the war on terror, but also, you know, maybe how you might approach the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, great question, and a really challenging one, obviously. You know, I think the pacifists and sort of peace activists have always been a bit of a minority, but they have shown that when they can build broad-based coalitions and when they can harness good arguments, logical arguments, fact-based arguments, and when they can engage in vigorous forms of protest and nonviolent resistance, that they can get successes. And I think, you know, the high point in New Zealand's history is obviously passing the anti-nuclear legislation, which really only came because of the strong work of the peace community and the peace activists coalescing across New Zealand and working together and engaging in a lot of often, you know, dangerous and forceful kind of action. And I think, you know, to try and make New Zealand more peaceful and to try and perhaps refocus our identity, our national identity and national purpose when we think about foreign policy on a more peaceful side will in turn take peace activists working really hard to try and build a movement and try and engage in kind of rigorous action, you know, in similar ways that the environmental movement is trying to create action and engage in rigorous, forceful movement to try and change New Zealand's direction in relation to the climate crisis. I think that's what we need to do in order to try and get there. But it is really, really challenging. And it's particularly challenging at a time like this when, I mean, as we saw in the ANZAC commemorations over the weekend, you know, political leaders all over the place saying, you know, the invasion of Ukraine proves that we need the military and we need to increase military spending. We need to be willing to sacrifice more, both the lives of our soldiers and our treasure and wealth for war fighting in the future. And kind of what gets missed here is the fact that war is just so incredibly useless. I mean, we've forgotten just a few months ago when the world's greatest superpower ever left Afghanistan in defeat. You know, 20 years of fighting men who essentially had AKs and pickup trucks and the world's greatest superpower was unable to militarily defeat them, unable to establish stability, unable to establish democracy, unable to do anything that it wanted to do with its great military power. And what we've seen actually over the last few years is a whole heap of research which shows that the great powers are actually finding it less and less possible to win wars. The number of wars they're winning is declining, even against the weakest opponents. And the Ukraine is a perfect example. Russia is, one of the top military powers in the world. Ukraine is way down the bottom. They still can't even defeat them. They can't achieve any of their goals there. Military force doesn't work. And then even if you think about, well, the Ukrainians are effectively resisting. Yes, but at what cost? I mean, if their country is laid completely to waste, how is that a victory? And if, hundreds of thousands of people are dead in the end. In many ways, there's actually some interesting research which shows that you're better off if you want to protect human life and still possibly win to, let the invasion kind of happen and then engage in mass civil disobedience, forms of resistance that make the occupation so costly that the Russians have to leave. And this is actually something we saw in Lithuania. I don't know if you're familiar with that history, but the Lithuanians, who are a tiny country, also couldn't resist the Russians militarily. But what they did was, and you can look it up, it's called the Singing Revolution. They actually surrounded the tanks and the Russian forces in their tens, hundreds of thousands, and they refused to cooperate, and they kind of held them hostage in a way. And eventually Russia was like, oh, screw this. We just can't do anything here because no one will cooperate. And they left, and Lithuania got its national independence. And now Lithuania, as part of its defense posture, has it built into its constitution that everybody trains and prepares for the day when they have to practice nonviolent resistance against invading Russian forces. In other words, there are alternatives to war that have been effective and that could be explored and that could provide kind of some hope out of this endless cycle of fighting wars, remembering them, and then fighting new ones and remembering them, and it just never, ever ends.
Hey, Richard, we're going to leave it there for today. Thank you. I kind of wanted to ask one more question, but you answered it. Like, what should people do when you have a neighbor walk into your country and you're like, it sounds like what you're saying is don't resist and then make life a huge pile of shit for the invaders so they want to leave, sort of thing. So it's a fascinating take on things, and I wonder what the world would look like today if there had been the kind of the priority of countries when being invaded as opposed to what we've seen for, well, time immemorial, really, isn't it? About battles and war and that sort of thing. But look, thank you for coming in. We really appreciate your thoughts. George, you want to bring up that newsroom article again, just to show people if they want to read some more of Richard's meanderings, they can head to. So newsroom under the title.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. There's some Richard's written some other stuff that we can't get to today, but maybe in the future around sort of counter-terrorism in New Zealand after the terrorist attacks in Christchurch, and also something we've also talked about a lot on the show, the sort of dangers of foreign fighters swarming into Ukraine. So appreciate those writings as well, Richard, and appreciate you coming on today.
Thanks very much,
pleasure.
Richard.
Thanks a lot.
Sweet.
There you go. So it's fascinating because that seems to be the argument, doesn't it? It's like, well, if you're going to be a pacifist, what do you do when someone walks into your country? What do you do when someone punches you? And I guess I haven't seen it, but I've already started to look up Lithuania's response on my little interweb box to see what they've done. But it seems that Richard's saying that there's research that says if you do actually resist non-violently, it's the better outcome for everybody.
I was actually watching a little video on Lithuania's military the other day, and it is tiny because they know that they're not going to be able to do much either way. They could spend like 50% of their GDP on their military, and it wouldn't make a difference. So what do we do?
I do wonder about that response though in other situations, like for example, Pol Pot in the killing fields or Hitler. If he had just said, "Okay, come and take it," I mean, would it have been 12 million Jews? I genuinely don't know, but it's a very interesting way to think about it. And I guess you can see how it would work. I mean, I always try and oversimplify things. It's probably a strength and a weakness, but to not hit back, to not be the person who escalates the situation can mean that the situation, even in an individual one-on-one, gets de-escalated, because if there's only one angry person, then there may be less chance for conflict, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah. I guess the key there is a sort of just reconceptualizing what war is, right? That maybe it isn't cowardly, or maybe it's in fact more strategic and realistic to do a sort of Lithuania strategy. At the same time, people like Richard aren't not sympathetic to people who take up arms. In fact, he wrote a book called Confessions of a Terrorist, a fictional novel, which was a sort of sympathetic look at a fictional like academic in Egypt who takes up arms after something happens to him and becomes a terrorist, right? So there's obviously it's not sort of his flavor of pacifism isn't denying the reality of people sort of taking up arms as a consequence of what happens to them, and that sort of thing. But I guess the point is to sort of reconceptualize and force a rethinking about what is and how we respond to it.
Let me share just something. One other thing before we move on is that I did a show. I'm looking it up while I'm talking, which is never good. With a guy called Adrian Leeson. Adrian Leeson is one of the Waihopai Three. For people who don't know, the Waihopai Three are a group of peace activists who took down the Waihopai spy base with a sickle. They went up with a sickle and they cut the dome and it deflated the bubble. And he taught me. When I say he taught me, what I mean is
today we're having a
that was me talking to Adrian Leeson. That's actually, he taught me that pacifism is also not, ironically, is not passive. It's an active thing. And so the point he was making was they did something, and I'm going to paraphrase it very badly as I scroll through looking for 80. So here's 80 in the program we made with him, talking about the Waihopai 3. He made a conscious decision to be active. So a lot of people think about pacifism and being passive as being standing still and not doing. I think what I learned from him was, whether it means pacifism or his form of pacifism, was actually active. It was front foot. It wasn't just sitting there and doing nothing. And that's Adrian 80 talking to us about war. And we had this, it was a conversation, another little thing that I have made and do make called Elephant TV, where we have sort of debates, and it was pacifist. And you can see in the background there's the army guy, and there's the army academic, and he was the pacifist academic, and then there was a pacifist. He was a pacifist. No, he was like the version of the army guy, because he was active in his pacifism, and there was also an academic pacifist as well. So that's what I learned about pacifism from him, is that it's not passive. Ironically, it's active. You got to do something in there as well. So
well, we've seen throughout history how successful civil disobedience can be in revolutionary movements, or in terms of civil rights in America, or whatever it may be. The simple act of the sit-in, for example.
Well, we're seeing it now. A big part of the Russians withdrawing from their assault on Kyiv was Belarusian railway workers sabotaging trains full of equipment. Mm-hmm. And look, they're not picking up a rifle, but they're definitely taking a position.
Yeah.
You look at what Schindler did. I mean, the very famous movie, obviously. Schindler got, he made that, the work that he was doing in his factories, and there's a quote in the movie, and I'll get it wrong, but it's something like he was going to make sure that none of the ammunition or arms that ever left his factories ever worked. So he was working behind the scenes for the Nazis, making various components for weapons, sending them out of the factory, making sure that they would never work. So, it's it's a pacifist look on the world, I guess. And I heard, now this might just be a old wives' tale as you hear, but I heard that there was something like only 3 times that Hitler was, well, I guess 4 when he stopped himself, but 3 times that Hitler was ever stopped, and they were all acts of pacifism. There was something about a priest or something getting on a train with the people, and then they couldn't send it. There was something about maybe the Danish or Denmark king putting on the Star of David, even though he wasn't Jewish, and then all his citizens put it on as well, which kind of defeated that. And again, I don't know whether they're wives' tales or not, but it's out there, that idea. Sure, I think we should probably move on, though. That was a really interesting conversation around that. Unless there's anything that we desperately want to finish up with.
One small point that I looked up while we were talking to him, there were 3,000 people during World War II in New Zealand that applied for conscientious objector status. Only 300 of them were given that status.
Wow. And the rest were sent, and then if they continued that status, were dragged in chains from the camps to the front yards, or front line, I should say, and then tied up, as I was just showing those images of that temporary statue put up in Wellington. So we're doing it. Let's just finish these last 2 comments. Non-violent resistance has worked, but definitely a long-term solution. However, there are plenty of examples where it crushed 1984 Orwellian terms, Hungary 1956, etc. Also, Richard saying, what we need is 200 world leaders to ring Putin and ask WTF his end game is, other than never being allowed outside Russia or public humiliation in the media. Yeah. Anyway, right. The next topic we kind of started on yesterday, but we're continuing it on today because it's all to do with the National Party, specifically Christopher Luxon, and his personal tax breaks that are coming up from what he earns, etc. This was on Today FM this morning. How much would former Air New Zealand CEO Chris Luxon make back under the National Party tax cuts? Tova O'Brien and Christopher Luxon discuss pay equity between high-earning millionaires in New Zealand versus low-earning public servants who have pay freezes on their wages. We just have a listen to the start of this and have a listen to the conversation that went on.
You made a good wicket, didn't you, in your last gig? How much did you earn as CEO of Air New Zealand?
It's not relevant, Tova. I don't know, but the real bottom line is, I've just said to you, like, I'm in a very successful, fortunate situation.
So let's just do a Sam Cedar here and go. Pause that. Is it a relevant question to ask sorry, Sam. I'm not saying that in a bad way. To ask the leader how much he earns. Is it relevant for us to know how much MPs earn? What do you guys think?
Well, I think they're talking about his wages as Air New Zealand CEO more than MP. But yeah, it is relevant because he's going to know.
Yeah. Yep. All right. I mean, I think that probably when you're making policy, which is going to impact the top several percent more so than the bottom several percent, then to know that you're in those top several percent, and probably always have been, is probably quite relevant. Let's go on.
And the reality for us is that when we come to the election, we'll have a very comprehensive tax policy that will make sure that we, in a fiscal costed plan, and it'll be very clear for everyone.
It is relevant because it speaks to how much people on much, much higher incomes would be getting with your tax cuts than those on comparatively lower incomes. So as CEO of Air New Zealand, I think the last sum I saw was about $4.6 million that you were earning. So how big would Air New Zealand CEO Chris Luxon's tax cut be on that $4.6 million salary that you were on?
Tova, all I'm saying to you is, look, we've got a short-term tax policy, which we've been really clear about. Common sense, inflation adjusted, help squeeze middle people today. What we've also signalled to you is that when we get to government in our first term, we'll look to unwind some of the tax increases the government has put forward.
Yep, and I want to know what that means for millionaires versus a nurse.
And fiscal policy.
I want to know what that means for a millionaire versus... Well, if you got rid of the 180K tax threshold, your tax cut as CEO of Air New Zealand would be $270,000.
Wow.
More than $250,000. Does that seem right?
So let's just bring context to that, eh? So this is the tax break, not the salary. It ends up being nearly $5,200 a week, the tax cut that he would be getting. Let's divide that by 40 for a normal working week.
Jesus.
So that would be a tax cut of he'd be earning $130 more per hour under his tax cuts. So we had this conversation yesterday.
That's
and
fucked.
The point that I made yesterday was and what Christopher Luxon admitted to in Q&A, that he doesn't need the $18,000 tax break that's coming with this. Yeah, which means which means what they're actively saying, let's not get this twisted, is we are giving those that don't need it a massive tax break. And those that need it most of all, they're going to continue to struggle with their $5 to $20 a week tax cut. So, of course, this is exactly the argument that many often put out there about taxing the rich, quote unquote, taxing the rich, because if they didn't get that tax cut, then that tax revenue could be spread over. Imagine how many beneficiaries would be covered with $270,000 a year. Like, imagine 10 people earning that money. You got another $2 to $3 million that you could put towards, I don't know, 100,000 people on the benefit by giving them, you know, 20 or 30 bucks or whatever it's going to be, but making it something that is significant to someone who needs it more.
Yeah, there's a lot of policies that could do with that money. They could I mean the half price transport has been I know it's sort of a policy that was put in place quite a while back before this latest sort of round of talking about living costs and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's a good example of where money could go.
Well, and Mr. Luxon's already earmarked that they're not going to continue that. They can't continue. He's already earmarked that.
I think that surprised a lot of people when they announced the half price fares.
Mm.
And people went, oh, okay, so are you telling me it's only this amount of money to have free public transport for everyone all of the time?
Yeah.
That seems worth it.
Yeah.
It seemed like an astronomically, like a surprisingly small amount of money.
Let's continue this on as well. Sorry, not to cut you off, Joe, because there's another point he wants to get to, which I want to actually explain to people, not in a patronizing way, but to bring context to it about how the wealthy pay the most tax.
Do you?
Well, we have a progressive tax system, Tova. We have the top 3% of New Zealanders paying 24% of income tax, and we have the top 9% paying 42% of all income tax. They pay a higher proportion of their salary in tax than people in lower incomes. That's the way our system is set up.
Your CEO tax cut would get you $270,000 versus a nurse who gets $800. So riddle me how that is fair. Why are you getting rid of that upper tax threshold?
And as I said to you, Tova, when we come to the election, we'll have a comprehensive tax policy. And all we've been signalling is we're going to be unwinding the tax increases like the Bright Line test, like the interest deductibility. We certainly don't want to see national awards, and we don't want to see national income insurance.
So to be clear, the Bright Line test and the interest taxability deductions is completely about property investors. So they're the only people that are going to, just for people who are unclear what those terms mean, are about that. Now, let me just also give you an example. When you often hear people talking about, it's unfair that the top 7% pay 40% in tax. Let's just think about two people, right? Just work with me here. One person's got $100. One person's got $1 million. If that person with $100 pays $50 in tax, $50 fee, they're left with $50. If that person with $1 million pays $10,000 in fees, they're left with $990,000, whatever it is. Close to $1 million. They've paid proportionally a huge amount more in fees and tax, whatever, than the person at the bottom, but it's impacted the person at the bottom a huge amount more. So don't fall for this argument that the wealthy are paying most in tax. That's not fair, because it's about proportionally how it impacts people. If I had $1 billion and I was paying $1 million in tax, that wouldn't touch the sides of anything, versus someone earning $30,000 paying $10,000 in tax. So I just want to, this is a conversation I've had before, and I want to hammer this one home. When you hear people talking about it's that the top 7% are paying too much in tax or the most in tax, it's because they have exponentially more to give, and it impacts them exponentially less. Over to you, boys.
It's also making the assumption that they are paying their fair amount of tax. Certainly people at that end of the market have a lot more tools and resources for moving their money around and paying people, accountants to find loopholes and all of that sort of thing to really minimize the percentage that they pay in tax and write-offs and that sort of thing. And then when you look at the IRD, how easy is it for the IRD, as an example, to go after someone middle income that might be cheating on their tax? versus going, all right, we're going after this big fish. He's got a team of 50 lawyers that are going to fight us on this, and it's going to cost us this much money to recoup that. They'll go for the easy target. They'll go for the easy win every time.
Yeah. Related to that, Chewy, the Revenue Minister, David Parker, has admitted basically by saying he wants to fix the problem with the so-called Tax Principles Act. He's admitted that they don't have the data or the tools or the transparency to work out where the concentration of billionaires, for example, is. He said that, the highest concentration of wealth they can sort of identify and analyze at IRD is people and businesses with $20 million. That's the highest they go, when they know for sure that there's concentrations of wealth higher than that. So they don't have even the adequate, I guess, tools and transparency and data to, go after those higher up earners in the country's wealthiest people.
Can I add something else in here as well, just before we jump back? Is that that's why I brought this screen back up, because you also notice that they're talking about paying income tax, and that doesn't actually show to Chewy's point, to your point, Chewy, at what their accountants are doing for them for their property investments and for their other sides as well. So they might be getting a chunk of that back because they're wealthy and they've got those areas to do it. But they also say the conversation we had yesterday about with the taxpayers union about productivity is that for a long time people used to talk about John Key being a self-made man and entrepreneur and these sorts of things. It's like these guys, what have they produced? What has Mr. Luxon produced? I mean, we heard in the Q&A show that actually, remember, he just talked about taking off things that will benefit property investors, red line test and the interest deductibility. Mr. Luxon's investments are all in property. He doesn't own a business. He doesn't run a business. He doesn't employ people in a business. He may pay people to do things for him like accountants, but he's a property investor, and he admitted to that in the weekend. So that's what it is. So now not only is the tax cuts they're talking about going to benefit him amazingly and other wealthy people, but the policies they're talking about taking him out are going to impact and positively affect him and his investments. It's almost like you'd say they're playing the cards just for themselves, and the rest of the country can go get bent.
Yeah, and his argument for that will be, oh, well, everything's in a blind trust. That was the whole thing. But broadly that, in broad strokes, the policies that you're implementing are going to benefit you. The other quick thing I wanted to say is, how dangerous is Tova asking you a question, just generally? Because that she's not going to ask you a question and not have the answer. Like, you can't duck her. He walked right into that.
It's that Marjorie Taylor Greene clip from the weekend where she was
yes.
She was asked if she'd ever called what's her name what is it called?
A traitor.
It's not. Was it traitor? And yeah, this is Nancy Pelosi, a traitor, and she had to basically go, well, hang on, wait a sec, because she walked straight into it. I'll bring it up, just if people haven't seen it.
It's so good. Can't hear it.
You can't hear it?
No,
I can hear it.
Oh, there you go.
Politically speaking, that would be correct.
In fact, you think that Speaker Pelosi is a traitor to the country, right?
I'm not answering that question. It's speculation. It's hypothetical.
Said that on the screen, that she's a traitor to the country.
No, I haven't said that.
Okay. Please, Exhibit 5, please.
Oh, no, wait. Hold on now. I believe.
Yeah, we don't have to play
good.
it. Pretty much. Anyway, so yeah, it's always good to be prepared with the answer to questions that you want to ask, if there are questions that you think the person is going to deny. So, yeah, I think Tova really showed her chops. No disrespect, because she's an amazing journalist, but that was an interview where she really showed her chops as well. Really, kind of, sometimes I get the feeling watching her when she was on TV3 is that we get it's the attack all the time, like when we were watching the COVID briefings. But we have this thing where we sit back and we let people talk. That's the style of what we do. We have space to do it. If we had someone for 4 or 5 minutes, like we crossed this with David Seymour the other day when he had to run out on us basically to catch a plane, that's the way you got to do it. You know, you got to actually jump in there and say, no, stop gish galloping, stop, studying your talking points. My question was, and that was an example of, can I actually say at the moment in media, the best of the best doing it? She's pretty brilliant at it.
I got to say, I've not always been Tova's biggest fan, but what I've seen lately has been very, very good.
Yeah. Shall we?
I just want to share Carl's comment here because it's such a good point that behind Luxon etc's, the whole point that they do this, that they say they do this, is the myth of trickle down economics, right? That somehow, the wealthiest New Zealanders having more money is somehow going to help people like you or I. And it's just
100%. Yeah, we know it doesn't work. The myth was if we give these wealthy people a tax break, then they'll reinvest it into, that's an American talking point. They'll reinvest it into the economy. They'll reinvest it. They'll start new businesses. They'll give people more jobs because they're starting these new things. But yeah, it doesn't work here because the investors put it into property here in New Zealand, as Luxon does.
Yeah. All right. Hey, just before we move on, I'm just going to acknowledge something that we're talking about in private chat here, guys, as well. If people are watching us can hear the banging, we actually don't know what it is. Doesn't seem to be on this end. It doesn't seem to be on George's end, and Chewy can't hear it.
I think it's Chewy. I think it's when you're moving around, the desk moves and
that's exactly
mic,
what it is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, I won't move.
Sorry.
So don't worry, we've got a way, speaking of passive resistance, that does not involve that, which we'll deal with Chewy after the show. Anti-passive resistance. Cool. Shall we go on to, this topic we're going to talk about now is something we're not going to spend a long time on because it's something we're going to look at later in the week in more detail with a guest. But it's really just a conversation around CNN Plus. Do I have any notes on this, guys? Sorry, I know that I wasn't really involved. I think I had a note in the it's a conversation around content and our content. Here we go. Yeah, you're about to bring it up, George. I can see you in the shared chat. It's a conversation around how content is being produced at the moment, the success of, shall we say, independent news media, and also the balls up that the mainstream news media are going through, trying to mimic a lot of the time independent media. And also CNN announced CNN Plus, which for those who don't know was their streaming service, which ran for about 2 weeks. I believe they had hosts on it who were getting $30 million a year. We can probably look up salaries and that kind of stuff. It's been around for 2 weeks. What happened was there was a previous CEO at CNN who resigned because he started dating his PA, and that was the reason he resigned. And it was his baby, and he was pushing it, and he wanted it to work. And they announced it as, this is the most important thing CNN has ever done since the day one it launched under, I think the guy's name was Ted Turner. So they considered this to be as important as the launch of CNN, whenever that was in the 90s. And within about 2 weeks, it's shut down. It's gone. Never to be seen. Well, who knows? Never to be seen again. They actually did talk about bundling it for a while, because what's happened between the idea for launching this and now is Discovery has bought CNN, and Discovery has no interest in doing CNN Plus. There was talk about bundling it with HBO for a while, so it not becoming a standalone product. But I'm reading the headlines that it's actually just all gone. George, you've had a bit of a look at that. Am I right in thinking that it's all disappeared, or are they still talking about just bundling it as another product with things like HBO and putting it on a channel? Do we know?
As far as I know, that strategy has fallen through, but I'm not as across this topic.
So one of the things you think about your favorite YouTuber. Like whether it's a YouTuber of significance, but who's just entertainment, like a Mr. Beast, who has 96 million subscribers, or if you think about a small independent channel like, we've got, I watch breaking news, or David Packman or Sam Cedar or those guys, even guys like Crowder. David Crowder's got Stephen Crowder. has got 5 million subscribers, and all the other guys are around 1 million sort of thing. They're around a lot, and they've got a lot of subscribers. Now, they're not all paid subscribers, obviously, so there is a difference. But CNN's model was to get subscribers on board who are paid up, who are going to then watch behind wall content, content of which a lot in the media were criticizing as dull and bland. And if they're not going to watch CNN, the channel, why would they then watch the special CNN hidden behind a paywall? And they had 10,000 active users. And so obviously, if you've put probably quite literally hundreds of millions of dollars, or at least committed hundreds of millions of dollars into a product to get 10,000 paid up subscribers, it's not enough to run, some of those channels that I've just referenced, which are independent media news channels with 2 or 3 people. It's not enough to make enough money to run those, let alone something that was being set up like a TV channel. So I know you say you're not across it as much, George, but there is also a conversation around how the media is moving, how the news media is moving, how the old model is dying. I mean, CNN's nightly viewership drops down to like 500,000 or 600,000 people for some of their primetime shows. I mean, that's 500,000 is how many watch TVNZ News. So to think about CNN having a show with between 500,000 and 1 million people is utterly ridiculous. And one can't really understand how these models work in a financial situation. One of the ways it has worked in the past is because they bundle it and sell it all over the world, and they have places like, let's say, Sky TV New Zealand pay them for the rights to show it on their platform because it's what's expected in places like hotels. But actually, as a financial model, it's not workable. So then to launch another financial model off the back of a financial model that doesn't work, guess what? Hasn't worked. And it seems that more and more of us are moving away from, although I still keep an eye, and I'm sure you guys too, when you see MSNBC or Fox News or Breitbart or CNN come across your feed, you still check it out. But by far and away, the majority of the news I get at the moment from offshore especially is independent news from independent news providers.
Yeah.
You guys?
I just think from a basic marketing point of view, like it takes more than 2 weeks for anybody to notice anything. If they didn't cost out running a product for, like, say 6 months to a year, that's just some real, like, you've shit in your own bucket and then kicked it over.
Yeah, and look, I think that, as I said, we're going to later on in the week have Craig Young, who is the CEO of Tuans, who talks a lot about technology and the telecommunications world. We might talk to him about the world of Twitter at the moment as well. Meltdowns happening around Twitter. Apparently, Elon. I've seen tweets from people saying this is going to be the start of World War III because Elon's bought Twitter. Not quite sure of the connection there, but that's what as you said yesterday, George, a random Twitter person was saying. But enough of a random Twitter, a blue check at least, so someone who's got some kind of status within the Twitter community.
Yeah, definitely. Because like I suddenly remembered Fox Nation, which is Fox's streaming service as well. Which so it's definitely a strategy that even though they're sort of, it seems like they're misunderstanding what they are. People want to put on, they've got the TV and they put on CNN and they want it there. They don't want to subscribe to something with shitty content, but Fox News and sort of, I guess as a vehicle of the culture wars, seems to be working, and it's been around for more than a year now. It seems to be, sustaining itself. And then I think of the other recent news, like Ben Shapiro's going to do like children's content and stuff like.
Good Lord,
stuff like
I don't
this,
like that.
No, the question is around paywalls, and just for someone to make it really simple, a paywall is something you have to pay for to get past. A paywall is your Sky TV subscription. A paywall is your New Zealand Herald Premium subscription, or and that's what making people pay for content is. Now, if people aren't watching your free-to-air content, what the fuck would they watch something behind a paywall? Very few companies go from giving something away for free to then trying to charge for who are successful. New Zealand Herald is probably the only ones in New Zealand who have done it successfully. NBR has a very successful paywall model, but that's because they have a very niche market of people. So they charge a lot and they don't need many people, in comparison to make money on it, sort of thing. The Herald has done it. I mean, I'm just literally looking at a story that's popped up on Herald right now. I'm not a premium specialist, but I'm thinking about it. Pushpay, the New Zealand tech company, story by Chris Keel, is said to be on the block for $500 million. And that's come up on New Zealand Herald Premium right now. So I think they've done a good job, and I think NBR has always done a good job. But other than that, another thing, especially in the news world, if you can get the same story, or at least a perspective on that story from 12 other sources for free, why the fuck would you pay for it? So that's why the Herald's done really well, because all of their stuff behind the paywall is typically exclusives or opinion pieces. So you can't get someone's opinion somewhere else. You can get what the latest score of the All Blacks game was anywhere. You know what I mean? So it's a tough thing. It's a tough road. I was working for NZME amongst 3 or 4 different radio stations there right at the time where these conversations around paywalls were going on. And every newspaper in the country, every media outlet in the country was talking about paywalls and what they were going to do. And basically none of them have done it. Because they were going through this adpocalypse thing, sort of thing, within the mainstream media as well, where ad revenue was down and it was being put into digital stuff, and people were losing it. So rather than having kind of, you pay a subscription to get our content, they, like when I was with NZME, they didn't own the Herald. You buy up the ones that are actually also doing it, and then you just drive more of your advertising dollar into it. So rather than having radio to compete with the digital, they buy content which they can then have as digital advertising. And that seems to have been the model that they've all, rather than competing against digital things, like even things like banners and Google ads and that kind of stuff, they've just got into that market, and that's what they've ended up doing to try and stave off the idea of not having enough money to make their content. So yeah, it's a fascinating thing.
I'm all for anybody that decides to put Mike Hosking behind a paywall.
Oh, I mean, maybe he's the one that could, but I guess at the moment, the advertising that people pay to be on those radio shows is huge. And I mean, there's no question that radio advertising still works. And in New Zealand, we haven't seen that drop off like the rest of the world has with radio audience. The rest of the world has seen a huge drop off in audience in New Zealand, and I think it's because of our size. Like, we haven't lost all our daily newspapers. In London they lost like 6. That's because they had like 9 in London daily newspapers, and like 6 of them disappeared because they had 9. They didn't need 9. Whereas in New Zealand, we have like a daily newspaper per major centre. And so it worked. And now what you've got, and this fucking frustrates me, is you've got them all sharing each other's stuff as well. So the ODT is full of New Zealand Herald stuff. If New Zealand Herald wants something from Dunedin, it's the ODT. RNZ seems to be on everyone else's platform. You see them on Stuff, and you see them on the Herald. And so that, it's on one level, it's actually a shrinking market, but we're not losing the content providers. They're just sharing content. So yeah, an interesting time. All right. I think we're wrapping up for the day. George has got to shoot off. We'll see you next time, George. You can just bail if you need to bail.
All right. Thanks, folks. See you tomorrow.
No worries. Cheers, mate.
And Sherry, thanks for joining us again today. How's the dog?
Yeah, no worries.
You got her with you today?
No, she's off on walkies at the moment.
Oh, very good.
So she'll come back all wet and muddy.
Very good. Sounds fun. Yeah, I'm going to try and get to the park today as well. It's get the park and the tennis ball, and if it's a wet day, as long as you've got an umbrella. Oh my goodness! And you're going into space.
Sorry, I've been dying to put that on all day.
That's cool, man. So you're doing that in StreamYard?
Well, no, I've got a piece of software that'll do it.
Behind your camera.
Just background replacement.
Yeah, that's cool, bro. Give us something. Have you got anything else?
There we go.
Is it The Simpsons? Something like that?
It's the This Is Fine meme. Dog sitting in a house on fire. And what else have I got?
That one about the Star Wars one was great because it actually had no. You've got a little, like, behind your name, there's a little bit of glitching, but actually put the Star Wars one back on. I don't think there was any glitching. I think it was. Oh no, there was a little bit.
Harder to see.
Harder to see. Yeah. No, that's dope, bro. What is it? If people want to find it, what's the software?
It's NVIDIA Broadcast.
NVIDIA broadcast. That's
Yeah.
NVIDIA is a graphics card, isn't it?
Yep.
Yeah. Cool, man.
So it's all
Excellent.
handled in card and handles the speakers and microphone as well.
Choice. All right, dude. Thanks for being on this week. We appreciate
no worries.
your time again. It's been an interesting couple of days, and we hopefully might catch you next week.
Awesome.
And other than that, I think we're going to all head off now and go and have lunch. Thank you for joining us today. Remember, #share our shit if you want to know more about us. You can just head to our YouTube channel, which is the best way to follow us right there. youtube.com/DOCNZ Studios. There's a bunch of other content on there as well, other shows and other sort of podcasts and things we do as well. But very good to be with you again today. Thank you for joining us. I hope to see you back again tomorrow morning from 11 a.m. Chewy, we'll see you next time. Everybody else, hooroo.